And today, we have somebody who's returning. As he said, it's 4 or 5 years, something like that. And he was so good. I've been wanting to get him back for a long time, and finally, I've got him back again. And he and his wife. And so he's a retired U.S. ambassador, and his wife, Alice, they're going to share some of their adventures and work during their 30-year U.S. Foreign Service career. The Kordaks were born here in Chicago. They lived and worked in 7 countries: Croatia, Serbia, Italy, Belgium, Poland, Venezuela, and Botswana. Ambassador Kordak worked for several presidents. He was nominated by President Reagan for an ambassadorship in 1988, was confirmed unanimously by the U.S. Senate. He took part in many international negotiations during his career and participated in 3 summit meetings in the 1980s. John, Alice, welcome.
You go first.
I'll put this out of the way.
Go ahead.
Well, thank you, Jay, for the introduction. It's good to be back at the North Shore Senior Center. It's also good to be back in the North Shore area. We know it rather well because on one of our assignments, when we were abroad where the educational facilities were not very good, we brought our daughter, and she's a graduate of Woodlands Academy in Lake Forest. It gave us a chance to fly in from abroad on a regular basis to see her, and so we're delighted to be in this area. This is one of the few times that my wife and I are speaking together. It occurs to me that I always speak to people and I tell them about what a foreign service officer does, what an ambassador does, what are some of the responsibilities. But that's only one part of life. And the two of us have been married almost 50 years. Mm-hmm. And somehow we have survived this hectic and interesting type of life, and we'll give you a few examples. Now, we're not the most, how I should say, experts on techies, so I hope everything goes well, and I will try to do the best I can with what we have here.
And we owe a lot of these pictures, in fact, all of them, to John's brother, Philip Kordak, who joins us here today. I have to give him credit.
Now, we look forward to sharing a few of our experiences, adventures, and work during our Foreign Service career. We will also touch on some of our activities in our post-diplomatic life. When I retired, I was one of the associate vice presidents at DePaul University, and I worked also for President Clinton, who appointed me twice to the United States Holocaust Memorial Council in Washington, and part of the responsibilities there was to oversee the work of the Holocaust Museum in Washington. Now, I did my graduate work in Italy, in Bologna, under the auspices of Johns Hopkins University. And there's an old Italian proverb which says something like this: from listening comes wisdom, and from speaking, repentance. And I just hope that we will have nothing to repent after we finish today. Now, there are many definitions of diplomacy, and let me share with you some of my favorites. One reads, diplomacy is the art of letting someone else have your own way. And another is the person who can tell you to go to hell in such a way that you actually look forward to the trip. But probably one of the most controversial ones is diplomacy is the second oldest profession in the world. Now, I take umbrage at that. I'm not quite sure I want to be compared to the first oldest profession. But it was said by Ronald Reagan, of all people, that it's been said that politics is the second oldest profession, not diplomacy. And I have learned, he said, that it bears a more striking resemblance to the first oldest profession. Well, as Jay pointed out, we are Chicagoans. We met when we were seniors in college at DePaul University. I did my work at DePaul, Johns Hopkins, and Harvard. And we met for the first time in the fall of 1963, right?
1963, we were on a bus to study the interglacial moraine of Wisconsin. And John was in charge of the organization sponsoring this trip. I was there just as a guest of someone, and he came, and there was only one seat left on the bus, and that was next to me. So we sat together for maybe 8 hours, and then
I asked you out to have a beer at Miller's Pub because the bus came back on Wabash Street, and she said no.
No.
And so I said basically to myself, well, the heck with you. And I went out with my buddies. We had a beer at Miller's Pub.
That was the fall of '63.
Fall of '63. And I finally came around to asking her for a date 9 months later, which was in May, just before our graduation from DePaul. And I called her up and I said, Alice, I'd like to have lunch or dinner with you. And I said, I'd like to take you to Trader Vic's at the Palmer House, where I took all my girlfriends. And if you recall, in the 60s, Trader Vic's was sort of the cat's meow. It was really a fantastic restaurant. And to my surprise, unlike all the other women that I had invited out to Trader Vic's, my wife
I said no.
She said she had an Italian restaurant that she would like to go to, and we went, and she told me that she knew that I had worked my way through college.
As I had.
And she said, I didn't want you to spend your money on me at Trader Vic's. And I thought, oh my God, this is the woman of my life. You know? We had 1 or 2 dates in Chicago, and then Ellis was touring Europe all that summer.
Because I thought I'd never go again. I was going to go to graduate school.
And I went to Washington to begin my assignment. Now, in college, I focused on the Soviet Union, on communism. My language in college was Russian, and I wanted to be assigned to a communist country because that was where my expertise was. And I was told as a young officer the only communist country I could go to was Yugoslavia, and there was actually two requirements. One, I had to learn the language, of course.
And then a big uh-oh.
And it was Serbo-Croat. And secondly, and the most important, they said, you need to be married. So all of a sudden, I needed a wife. And as I tell people, I had to get married, and my wife usually kicks me under the table whenever I say that.
But I must say, Mr. Romance, every place I visited in Europe, he did have my itinerary. He had sent me a letter. And so I was gone June, July, August, and I came back on Labor Day weekend. And
we got engaged. I think that was our third date. We saw each other again on Thanksgiving, and we saw each other over the Christmas, New Year's holidays. And I flew into Chicago on February 19th on a Friday night, late. We got married on a Saturday morning.
I might add, with the most horrendous haircut one could imagine, and I could say, I was thinking 50 years from now, you're going to look at this picture and hate yourself. So.
Well, we got married, and 2 days later, we were off to Europe and on to my assignment. And I thought we would say that's the best way with regard to a mother-in-law. You know, you leave her behind, take her daughter away, come back 10 years later as we did.
But my mother visited us at every post that we had.
But we basically had 5 or 6 dates in our life over a period of 9 months, and we got married. Would we have done that for our daughter?
No, I'd probably kill her. Next picture.
The one thing that we did is we honeymooned in London and in Vienna on our way to Zagreb, and when we got to London, we stayed at the at just off of Oxford Street. I think it was near Marble Arch, and mind you, this was the early '60s and middle '60s, and we checked into the hotel, And we were asked for our passports, and we gave them the passports. And then after a little while, the desk clerk and then the supervisor said, there's a problem. You know, I had a diplomatic passport, John Kordek. My wife had her tourist passport with her maiden name. And they said, we cannot give you a room for the two of you to stay in the same room. It's against British law. And it was at that time. You had to be a married couple to be in a room. And I said, well, we were just married. He says, oh, yeah. And I said, as soon as we get to the American consulate in Zagreb, she'll have her passport changed. And he said, well, we just can't do it. It's against British law. We cannot allow two people who are not married into the same hotel room. Fortunately, we had our marriage certificate, and I pulled that out, and he looked at it, and he finally said, okay, and we got the room. Our first assignment was Zagreb, but I must say that we'll talk a little bit more about Zagreb, and I have a few photos there in a little while. But since then, since we began our Foreign Service career, we have lived in 17 homes in our married life, moving 33 times during our marriage. That's probably some sort of record in how I mean, for me to move, it's not that difficult, but for the wife to pack and unpack and the family is really something. 33 times. I'm not quite sure many people could do that and still be married after 50 years. We made our home in 8 different and diverse places around the globe, and I worked on temporary duty in many other countries, such as the Soviet Union, Japan, and several others. Our life was unique, and we were fortunate to experience it together. We experienced hardship, including food shortages, rioting, attacks on our diplomatic missions, terrorism, and loss of colleagues. And one of the biggest losses, I'm from Arlington Heights, and the only other ambassador from Arlington Heights that I know of is a man by the name of Adolf Dubs, Spike Dubs, that was his name. We served together in Belgrade, where he was the political counselor. And he was killed when he was sent to Kabul as the U.S. ambassador in February 1979, just before the Russians invaded. And he was killed by a KGB assassination team. My roommate, before I got married, a man who was multilingual, one of the best linguists in the Foreign Service, he barely survived the Beirut bombing in April of 1983, when more than 63 people in the embassy were killed, most of the CIA section, and many hundreds were wounded. So, and we have lost other colleagues because of terrorist attacks, assassinations, etc. It's a way of life in the Foreign Service. Our first job was in Zagreb, as I mentioned. And this was in 1965. But before I go there, my wife wanted me to put this up. I grew up in Bucktown in Chicago. You might know the area. And I wanted to travel. And when I graduated from a college prep high school, I wasn't ready to go to college. I was 17 years old, and I decided the way to see the world would be join the U.S. Air Force. There was a draft during that period of time. It was right after the Korean War. So all young men, unless you were 4F, were drafted usually around 19 or 19 and a half. And I decided I would go in, and here's a picture of a handsome young airman. 17 years old. But I didn't get anywhere other than in the United States, spending a lot of time in Nebraska. I was assigned to a SAC bomber group, and SAC meaning the Strategic Air Command.
Okay, say it. You went to Newfoundland.
I went to Newfoundland. That was the only place I went to. And so I was sort of disappointed, and it took me a while to realize that the only way to see the world is perhaps to join the Foreign Service, and I was recruited when I was in DePaul during the Kennedy administration. My very first assignment in Yugoslavia was to be an escort interpreter for Louis Armstrong. How great could that be? Here he is with me, my secretary, and I forget who the person is standing in the rear. And we spent, 10 days together as he toured Yugoslavia as part of the State Department Cultural Presentation Program.
Okay, now I am going to give you the woman's point of view as I interrupt. One of my first jobs as a Foreign Service wife was to fulfill the food desires of Louis Armstrong. I was living in a hotel. I didn't have children at the time, but Louis wanted an American hot dog after his performance. There are no American hot dogs in Croatia, in Zagreb, in 1964. So I had to call all the other American wives. They looked in their freezer. We came up with a number of American hot dogs, and Louis got his desire of having his food wish.
And he had a very successful tour of Yugoslavia, and he was very pleased to have a hot dog after each performance, thanks to Alice. But it was great. This was my first assignment, and I was the escort interpreter for Louis Armstrong. One of the things that we did, now here's Zagreb. This is the old town. It's called Gornji Grad in Croatian. This is one of the famous churches. And the things that you see up on the tiles were the symbols of Zagreb, and then another symbol of Croatia, Dalmatia, and Slavonia. And the old town, the Gornji Grad, in the 60s, there were no cars that you could not park on the street. There were only two ways to get up there. One, if you had a car, and very few people had cars, you could drive up there, but you could park only where that church is, and there was usually no more than 5 or 10 cars at any one time. The rest of the time, you just had to walk, and there was a funicular that went up from the main part of town, which was like a big escalator to bring you up there. Now, we've been fortunate to live in a number of houses that have some historical importance. In Zagreb, we rented the apartment and the studio that belonged to what many people believe to be the most important sculptor since the Renaissance, a man by the name of Ivo Mestrovich. And he has a Chicago connection, and I'll just tell you about it. This was his apartment. Right down here was an outdoor atelier with many of his sculptures. This is our dining room, our kitchen, the master bedroom, and various other rooms. And we could dine and look down at many of his works.
Well, woman's point of view, because my profession is being a teacher, a special education teacher, and we didn't have children at the time, they needed a teacher in Belgrade. So while John was living in Zagreb, I accepted a position to teach in Belgrade. So every Friday after school, I'd board the bus for the 3 to 4 hour ride to be with him in Zagreb. And then on Sunday, it was in reverse. And on the bus, you have to realize that I was not alone. I was there with the locals, some of whom had the ducks, geese, and pigs on a string. So it was an interesting trip, and I did that for a whole school year.
The previous photo you saw was just the front of the apartment, how you got into it. It was a magnificent place. And as you could see, there are no cars. It was a beautiful place to walk around. Now, Mestrovich, if you go down Michigan Avenue to Congress, which comes off the Eisenhower Expressway, and just before Buckingham Palace, there are two Indians.
Buckingham Palace.
Buckingham Fountain. I'm sorry.
Duh.
You will find two Indians on either side, and this is the work of Mestrovich. So he does have a Chicago connection. He had to leave Europe because of the Second World War. He was not a favorite of the fascists, of the Nazis, and he came to Notre Dame, where he lived until about 1962.
You will notice a little person at the bottom of the staircase. Catherine was born in our assignment in Bologna when we were in Italy. when John was at the Johns Hopkins School there. And I must tell you a little bit about her birth. I was 8.5 months pregnant when we moved from our atelier apartment in Zagreb to Bologna. And I skipped the chapter when I was reading about childbirth, since she was my firstborn, about natural childbirth. So when I got to the hospital, it was quite a surprise that I was placed in a room and John was in another room.
Well, when Alice began having labor pains, we had hired a doctor who spoke some English because Alice did not speak Italian. And I took her to the hospital. She was received at the front door. I parked the car, I come up. The doctor was there, and he was in his suit, sitting in a very sort of a living room type situation. And I was a little surprised. I thought he would be in the room because I heard my wife crying
Screaming,
out.
actually.
Crying
Yes,
out.
crying out.
And he says, not to worry. He says, in Italy, he said, doctors are here only if there's an emergency in this maternity hospital. The midwives take care of everything. And don't worry about it. All of a sudden, one of the midwives comes out of the room, the labor room, and she says, spingere, spingere. And what that means is push. And so she wanted to know the English word for spingere, which I said push, and she says push, push. She ran back in, yelling at my wife.
And then she's this big behemoth woman who then lays on my stomach yelling, push, push.
And it worked.
And it worked. Catherine was unusual in her birth in that she was 7 pounds, very fair, very blonde. She was placed in the center of the nursery by the window because she was surrounded by 10-pound babies that were born who were Italian by background, very dark and with dark hair. And most people who came to the window, thought she was a plant, in that she was not real, she was just a doll. She was a doll, but not in that sense.
Well, while Alice was in labor and the child was born, the doctor gets up and says, well, I'll go take a look and see if everything is all right. And he does, and about 2 minutes later he comes out, he says, you have a daughter, and the daughter is doing fine. I said, well, what about the wife? He said, oh, she's doing fine too, not to worry, Italian women, no problem. He comes
Easy
back,
for
and
him
there's a
to
big
say.
bar. He lights up a cigar, gives me a cigar, pours some cognac, and we sit down, and he says, let's just smoke our cigar and drink our cognac, and the midwives will clean up your wife, and when she's ready, they'll call you, and you can have a look at her and the baby. This was birthing at a maternity hospital in Bologna.
Okay, now our
Now,
house.
this is a picture of my daughter in Belgrade, which was one of our assignments. And this is the back of the house. And again, it's also a very famous house. It was owned by a general called Dusan Simovic, General Simovic. He was, at that time, Chief of Staff of the Yugoslav Air Force in 1941. And if you know your history of the Balkans or of the Second World War, Germany tried to bring Yugoslavia into the Axis. And in fact, they signed an agreement with the Yugoslav government in 1941, which would have taken Yugoslavia into the axis of Germany, Italy, Romania, Hungary, etc. Simovic, the general, along with other members of the Yugoslav armed forces, did a coup d'etat. Very important thing. This was April 1941. And the Yugoslavs fought. The Germans had to send in X number of divisions. And it's slowed down their major operations. As you remember, Operation Barbarossa, which was the invasion of the Soviet Union, took place in June of 41. It should have taken place about 2 months earlier. Now, if you recall, the Germans got as far as Leningrad and just on the outskirts of Moscow in the winter of 1941 before the Russian winter took over and stopped them in their tracks. So what General Simovic did and his fellow officers, they slowed down the entire German plans, war plans. Now just think, if this didn't happen and if Yugoslavia joined the Axis, what would have happened? Would the German army have occupied Moscow before the winter and Leningrad? One never knows. Now, this is the only house that I ever lived in, and I think my wife, where we actually had a bomb shelter because of the general living there. It was a beautiful place up in the hills of Belgrade, overlooking a national forest, and Marshal Tito was one of our neighbors. This is what the house looked from the front, and it reminds me of a scene from Dr. Zhivago, the movie.
They didn't clean the streets there either. Ah.
This is our daughter again.
Again, and she's standing in front of our heat source. We didn't have a thermostat to run to, nor did we have radiator heating. This is called a pitch. And you see that little door on the bottom? You have to fill that with little tiny pieces of wood and to get it started. And I would start it in the late afternoon, and as I kept feeding it with wood, the heat would then radiate from the tiles. So you really had no control over how much heat was going to be coming out. We had 2 of these in our apartment. And my greatest pleasure in life at that stage was in the morning. Of course, the fire had gone out mostly, but I would still give it the old college try, get on my hands and knees and start blowing to see if I can catch an ember. Sometimes I did, but most of the times I did not. So then I had to clean it all out and then start again with my little wood burning.
And she said she'll never, ever live again without central heating.
Thank you. Yep.
This is very interesting as well. When we lived in Belgrade, we had a maid, and she was Macedonian. And our daughter only spoke English to the 2 of us and to an occasional American visitor. She spoke Macedonian to the maid, and all of her playmates were Serbian, so she spoke Serbian to the children. And this caused a cultural shock when we left Belgrade to go off to our next assignment. And we had some leave. We went to Chicago. We flew on Pan Am to London, London to Chicago. And on the London-Chicago flight, our son was born just that summer, a couple of months earlier. So we were all the way up in the front of a 707. And our son, who was only a couple of months old, was in a bassinet. And on that plane were a lot of children, primarily British children for some reason. And they would come up to see the baby. And they meet our daughter, and they speak English to my daughter. And my daughter had never spoken English to a child before. She could not get over the fact that a child spoke English. They shouldn't be speaking English. They should be speaking Macedonian, primarily Serbian. So when we got to our home.
When we got to Chicago, they were having a party for us, and all the relatives were there, and they kept bugging Catherine, say something in Serbian, say something in Macedonia. And she just clammed up and said, I only speak English. And that was it.
The last picture of Yugoslavia, and this is in Slovenia, Lake Bled, Bledsko jezero, which is our favorite vacation spot in all of Europe. Yugoslavia is a beautiful country, but that is one of the best places, high up in the Alps, just north of Ljubljana. Having trouble with this, here we go. One of our other assignments, and I'm skipping over our assignment in Brussels, Belgium. We spent 5 years there. It was a nice assignment. But my most senior assignment that I had before I became an ambassador was in Warsaw, Poland. And I was there from 78 to 81. This is the house that we lived in, 3 stories high, huge basement. I had a Mercedes, and I think I parked it out there just to take the picture, to show the car and the house. The house was very important in that it was also the U.S. Cultural Center in Warsaw. I probably had the best job in the entire embassy in Warsaw. I was the consular of embassy, but I also had responsibility for they were called at that time independent intellectuals, that is the dissidents in Poland, who were opposed to the communist regime, as well as the church people, the priests, the cardinals, the bishops. And this was a very special place. I also served as the number 2 at the embassy, the deputy ambassador, for a long period of time, and also as the chargé d'affaires. The chargé d'affaires is when you're in charge of the embassy when an ambassador is not there.
Okay, in this picture you notice we've added another person to our family, and that was Andrew. He was the baby in the bassinet. He was approximately 4 weeks old when we left his birthplace in Belgrade, and you see some time has elapsed. But just for the ladies in the audience, women's point of view coming up. When I was ready to deliver Andrew, there was no such thing as a private room or even a ward. So the nurses put me in what they would, well, it was the broom closet, to be honest with you. And the doctor was noticing that I was not eating much of the food, and it was like college food, mystery meat every day. And I noticed that the other ladies, when I would be walking around, had baskets. So how they were getting food was I had a little window in my broom closet. You had to get a rope, lower the basket down. You had relatives down there. They'd fill it up with fruits, vegetables, and whatever. And then you took the rope, and that's how you got a meal that you could actually recognize. I have to tell you, John did not do that for me. However, what he did do, because he was not allowed to visit me there because it was a woman's hospital, he had to disguise himself as a doctor with our doctor's permission, and that is how he got to see his son and me in the week that I spent there.
And that was in the Gynekologiska bolnica Prekoputa.
And it still had bullet holes in it from the Second World War.
Yeah. This is the interior of the house that you saw. This is just one corner in the living room. And this is where we did a lot of entertaining. And that was one of my jobs, to entertain. We had concerts with a piano, candlelight. We had receptions of over 100 people. We had lunches and dinners. And this house also has a historical significance. And that is the author, Mary McCarthy. You probably heard of her. She wrote The Group. There was a movie that was made out of it. She came to Warsaw, again on a Department of State cultural tour, and she met the man, one of my predecessors, who lived in this house, and she fell in love with him. Fortunately, she was married, he was married, and he had his wife in the house with him.
Whoops.
After a little while, she just stayed in Warsaw, and the wife left, and she moved in. And she built, and it's known as the Mary McCarthy Room, which is a very large dining room where we had our lunches and dinners. And atop the dining room was a huge plaza connecting to the master bedroom. So Mary McCarthy, and it was alleged that she wrote the novel, The Group, when she was in this house living with my predecessor, one of my predecessors. Now, when I was in Warsaw, there were huge food shortages. Solidarity was born. Cardinal Wojtyła of Krakow became the Pope. And the Soviets massed their army on 2 different occasions, at least 500,000 men each, to invade Poland in 1980-81. It was very difficult to live in Warsaw because the lines for food were very long. There were food riots. All non-essential embassy personnel were sent away. There was a small group of us who remained. We were supplied with C rations. Those who are veterans, you know, the K rations, the C rations, and now I think they're MREs, meals ready to eat, but I'm not quite so sure about that. It was at this time I was asked to leave Poland by the Polish Communist government for anti-Soviet, anti-socialist, and anti-state activities, all of which was true. But the State Department said the only way to get rid of Wojtek would be for you to declare him PNG, which means persona non grata, which means you have 24 to 48 hours to leave. But the Polish Communist government was told, if you do that, this would be the the consequence. We had a program called PL 480, which was approximately close to $1 billion a year for the Poles to buy food and feed grains because of their food shortages. And they paid in local currency, which was advantageous to them. And the point was, if you PNG Kordek, you then will lose this program. So I was held hostage, or they were held hostage for Kordek or $750 million in PL 480 funds. They said they would not PNG me at that time, but they could not guarantee my safety any longer in Poland, which is very, very consequential. So like 2 Catholic nuns, I always had to travel with 2 other people, to make sure something did not happen to me individually. Now this picture was taken when my daughter, to the right, graduated from the international school in 8th grade in Belgrade. These are 2 of the people who were on our staff. Pan Piotr on the left, a superb cook. I mean, he was just outstanding. And our house lady in the middle, plus several others. We could not run this house without staff. I mean, it just could not be possible.
We really did a lot of entertaining there, especially with the independent thinkers. Next picture.
Yes. The Pope. We met the Pope on a number of occasions. This was taken in Rome many years later after Warsaw, when I was on an American delegation, diplomatic delegation, and that's why you see us there, and we met again. But the first time we met, he was not yet Pope.
He was not yet Pope. It was 1976 in Washington, D.C., and he came from Krakow to help us celebrate our bicentennial. And we kind of already knew that we might be going to Poland, and John was studying the Polish language, which was just a story in itself because he studied it 24/7, had tapes, books, and things, and it was almost the cause for divorce. But we're talking the Pope here. So we stood in line to meet the Pope, and the line snaked around the room, and when I got to him, he said to me, "You're Polish." And I said, "Why, yes, I am." And he said, "You know what? We Poles can tell each other across a crowded room." And within 3 questions, he had my whole life story. After.
During the Foreign Service, I learned a number of languages. Polish was the most difficult. It was 1 year. It was like going to Berlitz on, like the program at the Foreign Service Institute was like a Berlitz on steroids. And you had to achieve certain levels of fluency in the language as you went along, or you wouldn't get the assignment. And contrary to the media talking about American diplomats not being fluent in the language, this was not true. I think the American embassy, the Chinese embassy, the Russian, Soviet embassies, we had probably the best linguist around. This is a picture from Venezuela, and I just needed a picture from Venezuela because I spent some time there. This is our ambassador meeting with
We spent
President.
2 years living in Caracas,
Yes.
sometime, yeah. Okay.
And I was again the number 3 man when I came, and it was a very difficult place. Our house was within walking distance of the U.S. Embassy, but I could never walk home. I was always escorted in an armored vehicle with a guard carrying a weapon, and I also had a weapon as well. And I point this out because at one stage I was the deputy ambassador and then the chargé, and the deputy ambassador is called the DCM in an embassy. And all of a sudden, one day I'm sitting at my desk and the Marines come in battle gear, carrying sandbags and a machine gun, placing the sandbags in front of my desk, putting the machine gun in place, opening the door. And the reason was because my office had this view right down the hall. And the key was we were expecting an attack. We've had many attacks at the embassy, and this would allow them to stop the attackers in their track. So this is the only time that I've ever worked anywhere where I've had a Marine contingent, I think there were 3 or 4, manning a machine gun nest with sandbags in one's office. Very unusual to happen.
And he did call me and say, "I'm not coming home for lunch."
Yes.
That's true.
One of the other things I did over the years, were in negotiations with many different countries, and in particular with Poland, since I had been in Poland. And this is me signing an agreement with the Polish government. This is when we tried to normalize our relationship in the latter part of the 1980s. And I have to stop here. This is a very important thing.
Oh.
I don't know if people here know who this is. This is Melina Macquarie. And at that time, she was the Minister of Culture of Greece. And one of my jobs was whenever we had ministers of culture or information or others, I had to meet them and then take them out to lunch or dinner or wherever. And she came, and the photographer always had a picture, that we gave to the visitor. And I was standing there as he was getting ready to shoot, and I said, Madam Minister, I said, when I was a young man, I was in love with you. I went to see your movie Never on Sunday. It was banned by the Legion of Decency in the United States. It was shown in very few theaters, and I went and I fell in love with you. She grabbed me, kissed me, and this is just after she let go. And that's my smile. Delightful.
And the picture never was in our house. It was always on his desk in his office.
One of the benefits of being a diplomat, I think. During my time in Washington, I was very fortunate.
Yes.
I participated in 3 Reagan-Gorbachev summit meetings from Geneva to Reykjavik to Washington. And after Geneva summit, I think the Geneva summit was Thanksgiving week in November of '85, I believe. And then the very first U.S. delegation to go to the Soviet Union was a delegation in January, and I was on it. The president's closest advisor and friend, Charles Wick, who was the director of USIA at the time, led the delegation. And normally when American delegations would go to the Soviet Union, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs would be the coordinating unit. This time when we went, it was the KGB. And the reason for this was because I think on our delegation we had some intelligence officers. And you could see the KGB, here KGB, KGB, a couple more in the back, a couple of Secret Service personnel that provided to us. It snowed every day that we were in Russia, in Leningrad and in Moscow. And our schedule was so very, very tight. One evening at the Hotel Rosia, which was the largest hotel in the world at that time, I get a call, and it's a woman speaking in Italian. She knew that I probably went to school in Italy, in Bologna, many years ago. And basically in Italian, she says, I'd like to come up and spend the night with you. I immediately hung up because one of the problems American diplomats have working in East European countries is you have to be careful for entrapment. And sexual entrapment was one of the keys. So I had about a half hour. It was a difficult time getting a towel or soap or anything in that hotel. And the phone rang again. And this time there was a woman speaking in English. She says, Gospodina, Mr. It was my sister who called just a month ago. She says, I'd like to come up with my sister, the 2 of us, to spend the night with you. Now, in that hotel room, the bed, I'm 5'10", and my feet would hang over the bed. It was like 5'6" or 5'7", the length of the bed. So I said, Madam, I said, I don't think there's room for 3 people on the bed that the Soviets have given us. And she says, Gospodina, Mister, the 3 of us, we find way.
Next picture.
Now, while I was in Washington, I participated in many NSC meetings along with Mr. Wick. The meetings were chaired always by the President Ronald Reagan. And at some stage, he gave me a call, and he said, John, he said, I'd like you to go to Botswana as my representative. And he gave me the reasons why he thought it was important for me to go there. And I, as a career officer, you know, you say, yes, sir, you do what the chief executive wishes.
This is, I like to add, this is after 25 years in the Foreign Service, and he's a career person, not someone who has given money to any particular Foreign Service, to any particular political candidate. And
Well, when I mentioned I was going to Botswana, I bet 95, 98% of the people did not even know it was a country. Where's Botswana? Turns out it was one of the largest embassies in the world, U.S. embassies. And the reason for that is that all of the countries that did not have diplomatic relations with South Africa, which was an apartheid regime at that time, had their diplomatic missions in Botswana. And we had wars all around. Wars in Angola, wars in Southwest Africa, wars in Mozambique. South Africans were attacking the frontline states, including Botswana at that time. This is my swearing-in ceremony, Chief of Protocol, and then the Acting Secretary of State, John Whitehead, in the background. This appears that this is a desk belonging to Thomas Jefferson. Looks like I'm signing my papers as an ambassador, but as the Secretary of State pointed out, I'm signing away 5% of my salary for the use of the embassy residence in Botswana. Shortly after I was confirmed by the Senate, I get a call from, again, Ronald Reagan. And he said, I'd like for you to come and bring your wife and your children. They were both in college. And he said, your parents. He said, I'd like to meet them and I'd like to speak to you. Now, my mother was an Alzheimer's victim, and she was sort of in mid-stage of Alzheimer's. I'm not sure she knew exactly where she was. The president, I must say, Ronald Reagan was a very gracious human being.
And for this picture, he told us where to stand. And when he told you where to stand, that's where you stood. He gave us each a gift, one of which I'm wearing is a stick pin that says, Office of the President of the United States. And he was most kind to give us at least 15 minutes of his time to talk about our assignment in Botswana, in Gaborone, which was the capital. And he said how proud he was that a career Foreign Service officer was able to take this particular job. Next one would be Andrew.
Tell me about it.
Well, while we were waiting, my son visited the NSC room, and John had been in the NSC room for some meetings. But as we were in the NSC, we met the president, we were on our way out, and my son turned and looked at Reagan and said, sir, he said, Mr. President, I go to Quincy College. And the president said, really? And he said, Quincy College played your college, Eureka College, last week in football. And you know, the president was on the team. And the president said, well, Andrew, how did we do? And Andrew said to the leader of the free world, we beat your butt.
And I still remain in the Foreign Service. One of the things, Shirley Temple Black. As you know, she was our ambassador in Ghana and also in the Czech Republic. And this is a newspaper article, and it's only part of it. And this was a hijacking. And I was on this plane.
Simulated.
It was simulated. I knew it's going to happen. I think the rest of the people on the plane did not know, and I don't think Shirley Temple Black knew. But she's a wonderful woman. We were in training together for 2 weeks, and we were on a plane going to Georgia to a special training base to learn to practice our skills with different types of weapons, RPGs, which are rocket-propelled grenade launchers, different types of bombs. This was a program during that administration to try to protect American ambassadors, many of whom were killed in previous years all over the world. I think we're going to end very soon, and I think what I'd like to say is,
we're going to end in 5 minutes.
Yeah.
We're taking our full 6.
yeah, this is the picture
Yes.
of the vehicle, my car, my driver, one of my guards. I had 60-some guards in Botswana.
And I included this picture because as we come from Chicago, my father was a tool and die maker. His father was a machinist. We worked our way through school. He worked his way through the Foreign Service. And the first time we rode in that car, we had the American flag and we had the ambassadorial flag. And it moved me almost to tears, because here we had come so far and we are representing not only the President of the United States, but everybody here.
This was a magnificent place in Botswana. The climate is very similar to Arizona. It's at 3,000 feet. It's a democracy. It's one of the very best of all African countries. This is my backyard, or our backyard at the residence. The largest event I had here was over 400 people, black tie dinner with an orchestra.
Sit down.
And so you can get a sense of the size of it.
A lot of entertaining.
There are a couple of more, and then I think we need to call it. But I wanted to show you. Jesse Helms always said all that ambassadors do is sit around swimming pools, drinking drinks and reading newspapers. So at a hotel, I had my wife take that picture, and I said, I'm going to send this to Senator Helms. And she said, well, if you do, you'll be out of the Foreign Service like that. But anyway, it was also interesting. What he did was that in the Department of State Appropriations bill that year, he also took out the health care system for U.S. ambassadors. He said ambassadors don't do anything, they just sit around. Yeah, a few are killed every once in a while, but they don't really need health care. And I remember my colleague in another African country sending a telegram to the Director General of the Foreign Service saying, what happens if I get ill? And the reply came back to all of us, said, don't. But fortunately, it was reversed, and we got our health care again.
This is Madam Chepe.
This is the Foreign Minister of Botswana, Madam Chepe. Secretary Schultz told me she was one of the very best of foreign secretaries around the world. I had to build, and the embassy was, the new embassy was being built. It was behind schedule. One of my duties was to get it built and completed on time. Now, this is a funny cable, because when you're in a big embassy like Warsaw, there must be 200 or more cables a day that go out. The name of the ambassador is always at the bottom, in this case, Kordek. I had over 400 people at the embassy in Botswana, and we had a large Peace Corps contingent of 240 people. And we had two American doctors from Kalamazoo who were on the staff, and they took care of all of these Peace Corps workers working all around the country. And this was the beginning of the AIDS epidemic in southern Africa. And this cable, you know, which I would never see until it goes out, because most cables that go out have to do with personnel or things. And it says, if you can't read it, it's from the doctors to State Department, and it says, please supply post with 1,000 lubricated Trojan condoms, required as soon as possible. Most grateful, Kordek. I just want you to know I never saw any of those.
Well, this is the opening of the embassy, and that's President Masiri. And those are two of the Marines that were assigned. There were, I think, 4 or 6 of them.
One day, it was the Botswana National Day, and they always invited leaders from different African countries. And this particular year, they invited a contingent from the royal family of Swaziland. I'm dressed appropriately. They're dressed appropriately. They have, as you know, the king of the monarch of Swaziland has about 300 wives. Many of the men have X number of wives as well. You can't take their picture. This was given to me by the British ambassador, and that night there was the formal reception at the president's house. And it was like Buckingham Palace. Everybody was in black tie, some with top hats and tails. Women were long gowns with big hats. And then the Swazi delegation, the men walked in like this, and all the women, and there must have been about 15 of them, they're all bare-chested. And I sat there, or stood there, I should say, and watched these women with big hats, long, people in black tie, and bare-chested women, about 15 of them walking just through the crowd. It was Kafkaesque. It was unreal. It was like you were in a Fellini movie. I think we're running out of time, so we're just going to end.
Okay, let's give him a big round of applause. That's outstanding. Thank you.